Welcome to the Growth Cap Podcast, where we chat with CEOs, investors, and other key industry leaders about the strategies they use to persist and succeed in business. I am your host, RJ Lumba, Managing Partner of Growth Cap LLC. In this episode, we chat with Bo Burlingham, the author of the acclaimed best-selling book, Small Giants. In the book, Bo provides a detailed account of 14 companies that chose to become great instead of big. We start the conversation off with Bo describing what company Mojo is. Thanks for tuning in and hope you enjoy the show.
Mojo, which is sort of like charisma. You know, it's the business version of charisma. When a leader has charisma, you want to follow him or her. When a business has mojo, you want to be associated with that business. You want to buy from it, sell to it, work for it, wear its T-shirts and caps, and so forth. And those were the criteria that I was using to select the companies. Now, I will say that the thing that fascinated me most was this question of mojo. Where did it come from? How had they been able to hold on to it? I mean, I'd known lots of companies, or a number of companies, well-known companies in the early 1980s when I first went to Inc. that had that mojo quality. A lot of them are household names now, like, Bill Gates at Microsoft and Steve Jobs at Apple and, a whole lot of companies, Yvon Chouinard at Patagonia, Tom Stenberg at Staples, Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield at Ben and Jerry's. They all these companies had this sort of magical quality at the time. And, it wasn't just that they were successful. There was something else that sort of made them extremely attractive. But most of those companies had, I was lucky because I got to know them when both the companies and their founders were pretty young, and I could watch what happened to them over the years. Fact is that most of them lost their mojo at some point. And these companies that I was looking at, the small giants, they'd held on to it, and I wanted to know why or how they'd done that. And so I looked at the qualities that they had in common. And I came up with, ultimately I came up with 6. Initially I came up with 5, but I realized that I'd missed one in the first edition of the book.
And what qualifies a company as a small giant? Maybe if you could just, talk through some of the common characteristics of these companies.
Yeah, well, I had certain criteria that I used to choose them. One of which was that I wanted companies who had the opportunity, like Zingerman's, had the opportunity to get a lot bigger, a lot faster, but had decided that they weren't going to focus on that because they had other goals they considered more important. Number 2, I wanted companies that were considered the best at what they did. In other words, people who really knew the industry, including their competitors, viewed them as one of the top companies in the business. And number 3, I wanted companies that had made had a positive impact outside their industry and had been recognized by independent third parties for the contributions they had made to their communities or to the world as a whole or whatever. Number 4, I wanted companies that had been profitable for at least 15 or 20 years. Number 5, I had to deal with the size question, so I came up with the idea of human size, and by that I mean a company that has not grown beyond the point where people don't know each other anymore. In other words, I wanted companies where the people at the top still had contact with the entry-level people and vice versa. The entry-level people still felt they had access to people at the top. And then finally, I wanted companies that had that quality that I called mojo.
That's helpful. And I noticed there's two software companies, at least on the most recent list that you have up at Forbes, that are part of the list. So you've got FreshBooks and Basecamp.
Yes.
And like as mentioned, there's a good number of CEOs in our audience that are software CEOs or SaaS CEOs.
Right.
Would be curious as to understand what you saw in those companies that made them unique.
Well, if you look closely at those companies, they're both very, very successful software companies, but they're sort of unusual software companies in that in their early going, at any rate. I mean, Basecamp I don't think has ever taken outside equity, and FreshBooks resisted taking out until a couple of years ago when it took some because it had a growth goal. And the thing that they're different from the sort of the standard model in Silicon Valley for sure, where basically everybody is focused on getting the money from venture capitalists or private equity firms. And one thing that goes along with that is, you basically, when you bring in a venture capital firm or a private equity firm, you're making a decision that someday in the not too distant future you're going to sell it.
I don't want to derail too much towards the investor conversation. I know it's certainly related to kind of how the company is able to evolve over time, but one of the things that I wanted to have our audience learn more about was how these companies are able to create that environment. Is there kind of one key common characteristic? And I guess we define it as mojo, but how are these companies able to get the best out of their people?
Well, there are a number of different things. They among other things, what they do is that most of them, once they get above a certain size, almost all of them, they have the attitude that they put their employees first. Their customers are a close second, but when you think about it, it's not that shocking because once a company gets above a certain size, who has the contacts with the customers? It's generally not the people at the top of the organization. It's the people who work for the organization. And if you want them to take care of your customers the way that you would, you better create a culture where people feel that kind of ownership of the company and that kind of identity of the company. And there are different factors that sort of go into that. I think one of them is having a higher purpose for the company. Since most of these companies are private, the idea of private and tightly held, the idea of working hard to make somebody else rich, you need to have something. There's got to be some reason why people look at what they're doing and they say, this is actually important. And here's why this matters. Here's why what I'm doing matters. And sort of the secret is it gets harder and harder as a company grows, is to sort of create that within the business. Most of these companies, well, all these companies actually, first place, they're run by people. They tend to be run by people who have a very clear idea in their own minds about who they are, what they want, and why. Because often they're faced with choices that, if you don't know who you are, what you want, and why, you tend to do what other people think you should do. And that makes it very hard when the tough choices come up to do something that in the end you're going to be happy with. The second thing is that these are all companies that had a real close connection to their communities, to the communities where they do business. I mean, to the point where it's hard to imagine them being in another community. I mean, one example of that I write about in the book was Anchor Steam Beer, which, it was and still is, frankly, a San Francisco institution. It's no longer a small giant because it was bought by Sapporo, but it had, it was, when I wrote about it as a small giant, that feeling of being part of San Francisco and being a San Francisco institution was really baked into the company. And you can have great breweries in other places, and there are great breweries in other places, but Anchor Brewing was part of San Francisco, and it was started during the gold rush, and it had been through all of the fires and earthquakes and everything like that, and managed to survive. And it was sort of a piece of San Francisco history, and that's actually been recognized by the city.
Quite a feat to have kind of all of those characteristics rolled up into one, and I assume you probably saw some pretty impressive CEOs and leaders of companies. Is there any one kind of particular leader that really stood out to you, and that maybe had to persist through some really trying times, or simply that just did things showed a lot of that showed a lot of character through the evolution of the
there were, as you can imagine, as you said, as you noted, actually quite a number of them. Danny Meyer, the founder of the Union Square Hospitality Group in New York, which was basically restaurants. He founded his first two restaurants were Union Square Cafe and Gramercy Tavern in New York, and they've been like the number 1 and 2 most popular restaurants in New York, according to Zagat, for about 15, 20 years, something like that. He also founded Shake Shack, which he then spun off as a public company because he wanted Union Square Hospitality Group to remain a small giant. There was somebody I actually wrote a book with, Norm Brodsky, who had a record storage company, which was a great company. He ultimately sold it for about $110 million, but he went through very trying times because, in the 1970s and 80s, he really was very focused on getting his company as big as possible, as fast as possible. And it led him to make some serious mistakes. And he wound up in Chapter 11. He went through a very, very difficult time. But he came out of it and he learned his lesson. And I tell the story of sort of what happened there. There's another. I would say all of these people. I could talk about probably all of the people who were the key people in these companies, because I have such admiration for them and understand they were doing this at a time when there was no support for what they were doing, where basically everybody would be telling them, you've got such a great opportunity here to grow, why aren't you doing it? And they would resist that, and because they knew what they wanted to do, and it wasn't what other people wanted them to do. And to have that clarity about yourself and about what you want. I mean, a great example is Gary Erickson, who was the founder of Cliff Bar. He got in the late 1990s. His two biggest competitors, Kraft, were bought by Kraft and Nestle, Power Bar and Balance Bar, and he got an offer from Quaker for $120 million. He had one partner, and that's a lot of money, which would have gone to him. And he came very close to doing the deal, but at the last minute he decided, I don't feel right to do this, and he decided to call it off. And basically walked away from, at least a $60 million payday for himself. And after that, he unfortunately his partner was not of the same frame of mind, and he wound up having to pay her the $60 million plus additional money, non-competes and things like that for non-competes. And everybody, literally everybody, was telling him he was absolutely out of his mind. That here he was up against these sort of billion-dollar competitors that could control shelf space and crush him. And at the same time, he saddled himself with this huge amount of debt. And yet, over the course of the next 3 years, the company tripled in size. He paid off the debt, and since I first wrote about them in 2005, 2006, they've grown, 10 or 15 times. He thought when he was turning down this money, he said, well, that's probably the last chance I'll ever have to make that much money, but it's not worth it. And yet, in fact, his stock is probably worth a lot more than that today. So, I look at all these people, and I have the greatest admiration for them, because they have been through hard times and they have made very painful choices a lot of times, or difficult choices, and they've come back. The result has been that they've created these companies that sort of by any measure are great companies. They're great in terms of how they treat their employees. They're great in terms of their relationships with their customers and suppliers. They're great in terms of their what they've done for their communities and for society in general. And they're successful businesses. So,
I think that's a good place to actually cap this off. I think they've proven, and you've shown a light on this segment of companies that have really done amazing things in their own right, and haven't followed the traditional path. So really the purpose of our conversation here, and again, really appreciate you taking the time, was to highlight that you can, as a CEO, as an entrepreneur, you can really think deeply about what it is you want to accomplish with your company, and steer yourself in that direction. Sometimes it's difficult because people are trying to coach you to go a different way, maybe grow, in an accelerated fashion, and ultimately, the path that one takes has to feel right with that person. So, I think your work is fantastic. There's a lot to be said about companies that create these amazing environments for their employees and their partners and their customers. That goes beyond kind of the standard metrics people use to measure business success.